Welcome back to the conversation. Now, the number of people detained following Monday's protest in Jinja district in Uganda over skyrocketing food and fuel prices in the country is now 25 after 17 more suspected protesters were picked up on Tuesday, the police have said. Police on Monday fired tear gas and arrested at least 8 suspected protesters after demonstrations against steep food and fuel price increases in the East African nation turned violent. With a population of 45 million people, Uganda is reeling from a pandemic-spurred economic slump, a situation exacerbated by Russia's war in Ukraine. Food price inflation has doubled to 13.1% in May, according to latest government figures. On Monday, protesters burnt used tires and blocked the busy Kamuli-Jinja Highway about 80 kilometers east of the Ugandan capital, Kampala, demanding the government subsidize dietary staples. Now, joining us live from Kampala, the Ugandan capital, is Simon Ssenyonga, a lawyer. Thank you, Simon, for joining us on the program this evening.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Simon, what's your take on the cost of living protest in Jinja? Most protests in the past have happened in the capital, Kampala. Was this expected?
I think most of us who have gotten an opportunity to discuss this in the media have blamed the cost of living to the Russia-Ukraine war. I take a contrary view. I think it comes from the policies that we took, especially the blanket measures after during the COVID-19 pandemic, the heavy lockdown measures. Now we are having attempts of the forceful vaccination. You're having, at the borders of Uganda here, I think Malaba, Kenya, you had truck drivers striking because they were being asked for compulsory vaccination status cards. So that has nothing really to do majorly with the Russia-Ukraine war, but the government policy response concerning the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a result of that, inevitably, it's not suitable for the kind of economy that we have, because where you have a majorly illiterate population and majorly an informal sector, people are not going to react logically to what you're making them to think about and how you're responding using the policies. They will have to take rather high-handed measures, just like the government is doing.
Okay, so let's look deeper into the reason for this protest. Now, in your own view, was this an organic protest, or was it, as the police has insinuated through the Kira region police spokesperson, that's Mr. James Mubi, that it was sponsored by politicians?
I think the political sponsorship talk is number one petty, but it's also the major scapegoat kind of talk, especially for security operatives. I don't think they will come out outrightly to admit, because they fear that if they come to make genuine admissions, then their superiors would perceive them badly. So look here, we are having now a more civically competent and civically awakened populace that is able to react and to enforce their fundamental human rights. So this is preserved under Article 29 of the Constitution. It's a fundamental human right to show your displeasure through activism, through protests. So there is no way they can just say it's about the politicians. Even if that was the case, that was the politicians. They're not saying that's just the opposition. So they could as well blame the government, the government-leaning politicians or ruling party politicians who are making ridiculous policy responses. We are talking about this after a budgetary speech that was not representative of the majority views of the Ugandans, but rather focused more on realizing the political mandate of the government, which is not fully representative of the Ugandan populace. So for me, this was ideally organic. It has nothing to do with the politicians. That's just being a scapegoatist.
Simon, prices of fuel, food and other basic goods have skyrocketed globally because of the Ukraine war, hitting vulnerable countries in Africa and elsewhere. We've seen protests in Indonesia, France, Greece, Kenya, Lebanon, to name a few. I recall that in your opening statement, you said, the government is to blame for this and the Ukraine war is just an excuse. But can you really blame the government for something that we can see its effect in different parts of the world? Can you blame the government for this?
I think you want to analyze it case by case basis. I mean, you've seen people in the UK striking, people in Spain striking, people in Australia striking because of the government's policy response concerning the pandemic. So not just concerning the Russia-Ukraine war. This is just a peripheral issue. The Russia-Ukraine war is majorly peripheral. It goes back, the root of this goes back to how we responded to the pandemic. And I'll give you very clearly. I mean, take examples people don't want to talk about in the media. Take Tanzania. People did not take that kind of response. Nations which never chose to take high-handed measures concerning their economies. So Uganda simply took blanket measures. And I'll give you a very simple example here. Look at the UN representatives from Uganda at the UN General Assembly. What was their stand concerning the Russia-Ukraine war? It was majorly the non-alignment policy. No one wanted to take any side. So ideally, they want to look good. So it's, you know, PR, look good before the global media, look good before the globalists, so that there is no way you're going to be perceived as antagonistic. The president himself has come out to be, you know, doesn't want to take a very clear stand concerning the war. I think he has gone for non-alignment. So you can't just blame the Russia-Ukraine war because it's not the basis. I can refer you still to the presidential speech soon after the Russia-Ukraine war, where the president was not just blaming the Russia-Ukraine war, he was still scapegoating with the politicians. But then you want to look at the Auditor General's report concerning how the COVID-19 pandemic was managed and used, and the resources were used concerning the response of the pandemic. It had nothing just to do with that Russia-Ukraine war. I think it comes from how we have managed the economy, what we have chosen to prioritize as an economy, and eventually the outcome. So that's the alternative perspective that needs to be heavily considered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, while you have termed the reasons for the protest to be quite justifiable, let's look at the manner in which the protests occurred. Now, the police have said the government does not support such protests, and the arrested suspect will be charged in court with incitement to violence, malicious damage. Now, does the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda not guarantee a right to peaceful protest? And in your own view, you're in Uganda, how exactly would you say the protests occurred? Because there were a lot of reports that they actually disrupted peaceful movements around the Jinja area.
I think, again, I would like to use my brother Gbenga's reference. For example, when you take a large scope of how the strikes have been unfolding, look at some of the nations that you've mentioned. Violence erupts when the police response is violent. Now, if the police is preconditioned to perceive protests as a threat to national security, even when they are peaceful, their response will be the use of tear gas canisters, their use of, violence, beating up the people. So ideally, the nationals have always tried to act peacefully. In no way am I justifying the fact that protesters should destroy properties. That's wrong on all fronts. But the thing is that normally police reaction determines how the protesters will turn out. So it's not just that people wake up to destroy the property, but normally once, if you have studied, if you have had, I'm in Uganda, I have had a chance to look at how protests unfold. While on campus, I was very active in organizing student protests. So I know that even when you wake up peaceful, the government is preconditioned to repress any manner of opposition. Because if that was the case, why do they then arrest those who speak out on media? Leading opposition figure in Uganda, retired Colonel Dr. Kizza Besigye, was arrested for getting a microphone, standing on top of his car and speaking out. Because that is the genesis of having all these, massive civic competence, which is turning into the protests. So it has nothing with the violence of the people, but has everything to do with the predetermined or the preconditioned mind of the security operatives towards repression of peaceful protests.
Discontent continues to grow over the rising price of commodities and fuel. In some remote parts of Uganda, fuel is selling for as much as 7,000 Ugandan shillings a litre. President Yoweri Museveni has repeatedly ignored calls for tax cuts and subsidies, urging citizens to live frugally. I do recall he recently said if you can't afford bread, you have to substitute and eat cassava. So how long can this position of the government be tenable? How can the government hold on to saying, we'll just allow free market economy to ride its course and we just have to ride this wave and go live frugally?
number one, it has to come from the government response towards such conditions. Now, if the government comes out and, for example, uses arrogant speech, uses some sort of repressive mechanisms, there's no way the citizens will receive that with goodwill. Because putting on the thinking cape of the government official, many of them would love to make genuine policy, responses, but the way they deliver them has a lot, especially when you're dealing with an economy which is majorly having the informal sector, having a large illiterate population, having many who are uneducated and many who are recovering from repressive measures that you put because of the lockdowns. Secondly, you have to assess at a technical level and from a policy level what the government prioritizes during the budgetary discussion. For example, the government is saying the biggest share of the budget is going to, number one, human capital development, specifically focusing on what they're calling a parish development model in Uganda. This is a model which is meant to redistribute resources and income to the commonest man. But look here, the government has been the one which has been destroying the local government system. Where it wants to roll out majority of the resources, there are no existent officials to monitor that. The president of Uganda has committed in the parish development model to allocate 30% of the resources which are going to go at the parish level to youth entrepreneurial schemes. But what is happening in the implementation of this and the rolling out of this program? The youth are being left out. And it's the youth who are participating in this protest, the ones who are being used to participate, the ones who are coming out to participate in the protest. So where you alienate a majority population and then you think that you will explain to them from a high level because you're trying to appease your global interests and you're trying to appease your political, your political appetite, there is no way you think that they will receive you well. So in essence, it's not tenable. I think, number one, it's a policy discussion. It is a moral discussion. But above all, as a country, we need to reflect because this has nothing to do again with just those in government, those in power. Because there are many who are in opposition, but they're also sitting in parliament and they're supporting some of these policies. So it's also ruling class, but also those in opposition who have sold their souls towards the failure to realize the mandate of the common man who sent them there.
Now, a lot of people all over the world are having this economic impact, especially due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But in most remote parts of Uganda, petrol is selling for about 7,000 shillings a litre. That is about $1.85, a twofold increase since February. So let's have a feel. How are ordinary Ugandans coping with the high cost of living?
I think, it's a broad question, and I think it varies case by case basis. So you want to try to categorize, for example, for you to assess the genuine impact. You want to look at those, say, the urban poor. You want to look at those, even the elites themselves are already feeling the pinch because of the tax policies that we have in Uganda. But now for the common man, you want to look at it from the angle of they have to rely, for example, on the petrol or on the fuel. We have many borders in or what you call motorcycles in Uganda. Most of those have to not only transport themselves, they're the ones who the students in schools have to rely on to move. The person in the market, the woman in the market who is selling onions, cabbages, have to rely on these fuel prices. Public transport is one of the biggest transport mechanisms that we have in Uganda. So many are abandoning their private means of transport and they are using the public transport. But now public transport is heavy. So if you look at, for example, the market setting, I see the display of the picture, the market setting, most of the products that you're having are coming from the rural areas. Now that means if the prices are high, inevitably those who have to consume the products are not going to, first of all, access them in time, but secondly, if they access them in time, they are going to be very expensive. So it pinches on all sides, not only purely economically, but even socially in terms of access to other fundamental rights, which are a supplement to the right to life. Because the courts of law in Uganda, the constitutional court specifically in the case of Salvatore Abuki versus the Attorney General of Uganda, has said that the right to life is not just about breathing in and out. It has everything to do with a dignified life. So these policies eventually affect the dignity of the people, not just their breathing in and breathing out, but the dignity and how we are being perceived as a nation. How the mother down at the village, the young person driving the motorcycle, is deserving to survive.
Now, Simon, looking at solutions to this situation and alleviating the sufferings of ordinary Ugandans. In his last State of the Nation address, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni said that government subsidies or removal of import taxes will collapse the Ugandan economy. He said there would be a hemorrhage of dollars from the national reserves for the purchase of those expensive products. So my question to you is this. The people are demonstrating, they said, look, things are too expensive. So what are the options left for the Ugandan government? And in what ways can it alleviate the hardship of the people since it has already ruled out tax cuts and subsidies?
So the two reasons that are advanced by the president of Uganda, I think, are very narrow. You cannot just blame the economic situation based on the import and export issues. The major crisis that we have in Uganda, I think Africa largely and all over the world, is the lack of the fiscal discipline. Because fiscal discipline speaks to how you're, number one, going to prioritize your resources. Number two, how you're going to utilize your resources. Number three, how you're going to account for those resources. Number four, how you're going to allocate the resources. So what are we having right now in Uganda? You're having a major financial hemorrhage coming because of the failure to implement corruption policies. We are having, for example, speaking about it, Mr. Museveni, the president, is very concerned about our international image. In Uganda right now, we are having a serious closing down of the civic space in Uganda. You've heard that the biggest NGO donor fund in Uganda is being given about 6 months to wrap up business in Uganda. Why? Because they are questioning the fiscal discipline of Uganda. They are creating civic competence that is now awakening people to exercise their fundamental human rights. Number two, take an example, for example, under the Public Finance and Management Act of Uganda. It creates what is called what's called the Consolidated Fund. The idea of that is that resources have to be allocated for purposes of contingency measures. For example, when a pandemic breaks out, what has been happening? There hasn't been prioritization. If you think about accountability and following through on all the resources, the government needs to think critically about implementing the Auditor General's report because it gives them the gaps that are existent. For example, the mismanagement of the budget, the passing of supplementary budgets. We're coming from June, where we have just passed a national budget. As we speak right now, a bigger supplementary budget is being passed. And most of these supplementary budgets are passed before they are ascertained and approved by the parliament. So the fiscal discipline is the biggest solution because it will help us prioritize, it will help us allocate specifically and strategically, it will help us appreciate the common need of the common man as opposed to the political aggrandizement that comes with those who are sitting in the elitist offices at the political echelons of power.
Okay, Simon, fiscal discipline, you say, is the answer to those problems. But the finance minister promised no intervention, citing that the free market philosophy will tame rising prices. Now, what do you make of this? And we see more protests brewing in coming months.
I think you also want to critically assess the positions of the position of the finance minister over the past, let's just make it fair enough for him, over the past 5 years where he has been in power. Under his watch, you've had massive corruption scandals in Uganda on very, very, very simple issues. You've had the mismanagement of COVID relief funds. I've told you before on this platform that Uganda got grants from the African Development Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank. Majority of these were mismanaged. When you read the budgetary speech of 2020, crossing into 2021, the theme of the budget was the recapitalization of the Ugandan economy, directly falling under his docket as the Minister of Finance of the Uganda Development Bank. What happened with the recapitalization? The resources were mismanaged and they were given to the rich elites in Uganda to run their businesses further. Number two, I think apart from only his ministry, other line ministries which received COVID relief funds, Ministry of Health among others, never did any private audits, which was a priority requirement as long as you're getting capitation grants and other grants from other, international monetary platforms. So what happens is that himself is not the authority to speak to what the aspirations of the nation is or are because they haven't lived up to the standard. But secondly, to broaden the picture, Look at the arms of government and what has been their position in terms of responding. The judiciary, for example, has been curtailed, number one, in terms of giving them officers to clearly follow through on issues of corruption and fiscal discipline. Number two, the inspectorate of government, which is charged with ensuring that there is proper accountability and discipline in government offices, has not had substantive officials for a long time. When they came in, a program which was meant to help them follow up, which was sponsored by the biggest NGO donor fund, was suspended. So government has no commitment towards ensuring the judiciary realizes its roles. The parliament is just a rubber stamp of government policies. I've showed you through the supplementary budgets, but also through what they prioritize as key issues. Right now, when you're grappling with financial issues, the parliament is more interested in impeaching a member of parliament who spoke negative about the sitting speaker of parliament. But even the executive itself, what do they say? They are bound by the principle of
Simon, I see so many issues going on in Uganda. You talk about lack of discipline, the parliament being a rubber stamp while people are still suffering in Uganda. We can go on and on and on. But thank you so much, Simon. Due to time, we'll have to end this conversation here. Thank you so much, Simon, for joining us on this conversation.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
That was Simon Ssenyonga, a lawyer joining us from Kampala, Uganda. And that is how much we could take on today's edition of the conversation. In the first half of the program, we did look at the situation in Mali, where 49 Ivorian citizens were detained and arrested by the Malian government. And we just concluded our conversation on the arrest of 25 protesters in Jinja over the rising cost of commodities. I'm Gbenga Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. See you again on Friday.